Welcome to Unlayer, the show where we explore next-gen blockchains. I'm your host, Saul, and today Zen is standing in for Dave. And together we are joined by Isaac, aka Snomi, who is the co-founder of Gator Labs, where he hopes to design incentive systems that lead to better societal outcomes at scale. Their first product, which is in open beta, is called Chomp, which you may have seen on Twitter. Chomp is a quiz game that leverages wisdom of the crowd to get you the best answers, and it's available to use today. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I want to start off with is just your background and how it kind of positioned you to build what's essentially kind of a quiz game that gamifies multiple human behaviors. Tell us a bit about how you landed on this particular project, given what you've been working on before.
Yeah, sure. I think I've always been like interested in human behavior. I studied neuroscience and specifically like psychobiology in undergrad, and then I actually went into advertising when I decided I didn't really want to be a doctor. And advertising is all about human behavior and how to get people to buy something or create an emotion with some sort of creative that speaks to people in kind of like some way. And then I went back to grad school and I was in a PhD program for economics out in California at Claremont. And then kind of learned a lot about human behavior at scale in a different kind of sense from the economic side, as opposed to like, okay, like how can you trigger specific actions with like creative or words? How can you do that with incentives? And then actually dropped out of my econ program at the end of 2021, the start of 2022, after I got my master's and started working in crypto, like around the space, doing different token designs and incentive systems. I've worked on like a lot of different things from like AAA game economies to stable coins, to interest rate models, to kind of like everything in between on figuring out how to get people to do something with incentives or with some sort of an economic system.
So this was part of, just to clarify, this was part of, you have another project as well called
Yeah,
Hexagon
so I
Research?
have a company called Hexagon Research that does like consulting, and that's what I've been doing most of, like this work through for the past couple of years. And then last August, I met KZ, my co-founder, at the Solana Hacker House in Berlin, and we kind of hit it off and got to talking about a lot of kind of like the things that we believe about crypto and ways that we can use blockchains to make the world slightly more equitable, and kind of add context and opportunities to the world that don't currently exist, that we think like push it in the right direction. um, and so we started to think about information a lot, and the idea that like there's a lot of problems with information, like in crypto and outside of crypto specifically, but within crypto obviously like there's scams and rugs and people don't really know where to go to figure out what is real or what isn't, and it's pretty difficult and can be pretty scary for a lot of like new participants. And so that was kind of something that we started to think about, is like how can we create kind of like education systems or information systems that create this sort of information for those types of users as sort of like an externality of like the economic system or the product. Um, and we eventually kind of landed on a game that's initially targeted to like crypto people, and we mostly talk about crypto related things for right now. But that is really generalizable and can be done for like really any topic. And so while we're kind of like starting within crypto and kind of want to get crypto users as our beta testers who understand kind of like some of the tech on the back end and like how to use tokens and wallets and things like that. But I think like our vision for this is a lot larger than just crypto information. We think that like in general, the information landscape of the world kind of like sucks, and there's a lot of things missing from it, and there's a lot of things that are trying to explicitly manipulate you or bias you or get you to make some decision that maybe you don't necessarily want to make, and you just don't really know all of that. Like it's already very difficult to tell like what's AI generated and what's not. I get fooled every now and then because I'm not paying super tight attention all the time, and so there's just seemingly like a lot of context missing. Like what do other people think about this, or like what are other people's opinions, without having to go through like hours and hours of Reddit pages and like Googling and talking to ChatGPT about things. How can you yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you here, but I guess like this is a good point to actually like dive into like what Gator the app is, right? So maybe we can step back for a second before we dive into the incentives, because I think it'll give the audience a little bit of a clearer understanding of what you're talking about. So maybe you could just describe Gator at a high level and how it works, and the general decision-making principle behind it.
Yeah. So Gator and Chomp are slightly different. So Gator is kind of like the company that we have that makes Chomp the product. And so Chomp is like the first kind of game that we're making. But Gator as a company, we want to make more of these types of games that contribute to what we call like our information layer or our data layer, which is basically a social graph. And so we are going to be tracking like individual people and kind of the information that they have access to, that they are likely to be, right in. And that's really our goal, which is, how can we create like context for information through games? And that's really the world that we kind of see, where people play these 3 to 5 minute games, 10-minute games, on their commute, when they're on the toilet, doing nothing on the couch, like whatever. It's just kind of like a little bit mindless. It's fun. There are some incentives, there's some kind of like degen stuff, but it's not really like a lot of money, and it's more just kind of like enjoyable. And those are the kinds of games that we want to create, that we think people really want to engage with. And Chomp is really the first one of those.
Can you give me an example of a type of information that benefits from this design pattern? So I think I get what you're saying, which is, you have more people partaking in these quizzes, you have human feedback that can kind of distill lots of information and get you to, I guess, the quote unquote truth, but maybe an example of what's usually hard to figure out that can be easier now through something like Chomp or Gator.
Yeah. So there's two good examples for this that I usually give. So the first is for like businesses. So if you're, a business, you're spending a lot of money on product research, on user feedback, on figuring out what your users want, what they're, interested in, how they think about your product, how they feel about your product, and those kinds of questions, or those kinds of research are primarily done through surveys already, and there are really, really large firms who make billions of dollars a year doing this kind of research, and this makes it significantly more accessible to almost anyone, right? Because if I can come and make questions and decks and then go get people to answer them, then I don't have to pay like some agency, $150,000 retainer to do user feedback for me, basically. And that creates a lot of access to information if we can get the users, obviously. And the other one that's probably more interesting to users is like market sentiment and trading information. This is one of my favorite examples. So let's say like we ask the question, is WIF gonna hit a $10 billion market cap? So when we ask this question, we have users answer two different like questions in relation to like the question, is WIF gonna hit a $10 billion market cap? And the first question is like, what do you think the answer to that question is? Like, yes, it will, no, it won't. And then what percent of people do you think answered yes to this question? So we call this the first order question and the second order question. The first order question is, what do you believe? And the second order question is, what do you believe about other people's beliefs? And this other people's beliefs aspect of it is where we pull out a lot more information. And I can go into some of the mechanism design behind the actual mechanism in a bit, but basically, if 80% of people say WIF is going to hit $10 billion and 90% of people say, or the expectation is that on average 90% of people would have said yes, the answer that we actually pull out on the back end here is no, WIF will not hit $10 billion. And this isn't necessarily like a prediction. It's not going to say like, oh no, this is never going to hit $10 billion. It's more of like a sentiment test to see how the market is kind of like thinking about it. And if you think this through, this is actually counterintuitively the correct answer. So if 80% of people already think this asset's going to go to $10 billion and it's at, I don't know, $2 billion, right? That's a 5x. So like, why wouldn't I hold this asset? So you can kind of assume that everyone who says yes, this asset's going to go to $10 billion is already exposed in some way to this asset. And so that's 80% of the population. And then at the same time, people are basing their second order answers, like what they believe about other people's beliefs, on generally their circle of interaction and the people and information that they interact with on a more regular daily basis. And so you're getting all of these people in crypto to say, I'm exposed to this asset and I think this asset's going to go up a lot. And then they're also saying that my friends and the people that I know and interact with are also exposed to this asset and they also think it's going to go up a lot. And so if that's true and that's the case, like, who's left to buy the asset? So in the market, the sentiment is actually like, no, like this may not just go up because like everyone thinks it's going to, continue going up. And so if you think about it, like, who are the participants left that are going to come in? Well, you can say like, oh, retail who's not here yet, or like, other people who we can, dump our bags on or whatever. But like all things, staying the same, like that's actually the correct result there, which is super interesting.
So I guess like diving into the mechanism design behind that, like how it seems a little bit dependent on the question you ask as to how you would interpret like the primary and secondary answer. So
Yeah.
how do you automate that, or do you have like a different way of like, does every question that gets submitted need to have like a certain, back end like way of understanding the data that comes in? How do you kind of like do that
So
like across like a
we've
wide set of
standardized.
questions?
Yeah, sorry. We've standardized the the answering a lot. So generally the answers are yes, no answers for right now. We'll add multiple choice answers in the next like month or two, hopefully, or more multiple choice answers. At least we have some, and so that's very standardized. Like you're basically answering the same question, but to your point, the words that you pick in a question really matter. And they change the outcome of the question, or they can change the outcome of the question. Like framing bias is something that we think about a lot when we're making questions and how to eliminate framing bias. And I mean, there's different kind of biases in there as well, but framing bias is probably the biggest one. Um, and and so we don't necessarily have like an explicit process for like creating the questions, but we have like a 5 or 6 page like design document for like how to write a good question. It's like, be as specific as possible, like leave nothing to interpretation. Don't use like jargon or acronyms. Like remove framing biases or like emotionally charged words. Like all of that kind of like good stuff that basically talks about different ways that the end answer that you get may not be the answer that you were actually looking for when you asked that question.
So maybe now is a good time to go back to some of the earlier points you brought up, which is, how do you define better information? What makes it better? Is it kind of this framework you're enshrining around the process of collecting multiple answers to the same question? How would you describe that?
Yeah. So there's a couple like pieces to this. The first one is that kind of like as I described, like if 80% of people say yes, the answer can still be no. Um, and wisdom of the crowd, most people think like, democratic governance, democracy, like pure voting, that kind of thing. Um, there's a lot more to the wisdom of the crowd than just like more than 50% of people vote this, so this is the answer. And what we do with the mechanisms the mechanism that we currently use, which is called surprisingly popular, basically, we're calling that the best answer because it's not necessarily the right answer or true. Like in theory, like this mechanism, with answers that have like objective resolutions, like what's the capital of Illinois, or what's the capital of Saudi Arabia. Um, it at large scale with a sufficient sample size will always pull out the correct answer, which is very interesting. And so we obviously don't have super large sample sizes, and we're asking subjective questions. And so we call things like the best answer, because it's not necessarily like true or right. It's the best answer that we have right now. And that is going to get a lot more contextualized over the next kind of like months and years as we continue to build. So like right now we have surprisingly popular one mechanism. We've also been working on the implementation of another mechanism called population mean-based aggregation, which will hopefully be ready soon. And we're also working on a couple other mechanisms that are slightly further out on the background. And so it's not just going to be, one mechanism's answer. It's going to be how can we continually refine the mechanisms that we come across or create to be more consistent in terms of the outputs. And, now we'll have all of these data and all of these answers on, how people responded to them. And we can really test a lot of this mechanism design with data that really just doesn't exist anywhere else. And then on top of that, we have what we call like the likelihood score and the reputation scoring. So the likelihood score is something that we hope contextualizes like the best answer a lot, which is basically how that will work is it'll be on an S curve. So if we have no idea whether or not the best answer is likely to be true, it's like at 50. So it's like right in the middle of that S curve. And then it can move up along the S curve and eventually, maybe after like years, get to, like 99% likely to be true. Or it could go the opposite direction and be like 1% likely to be true. But the best answer is not something that like you get from like one sample. It's not something you get from a small sample size, and it's not something that you get from sampling at one point in time. This is something that should be continuous and fairly like amorphic and kind of like change a lot as people's like opinions change. And it will occasionally be wrong, right? It's certainly not to say like, oh, okay, these are just like always true answers and we're going to get everything right. And, we're the single source of truth for the internet. Like that's ridiculous, right? Like no one will ever achieve that because that's just impossible. And I can go into a long spiel about why that's impossible. But our hope is really to make these kinds of games and metrics through the mechanism design that make the information better through contextualizing that information and kind of showing you like what other people think, what um, like even asking the questions themselves. Like people are like, oh, like this is a weird question. This makes no sense. But like someone else is like, oh, I love this question. Like I'm so glad somebody else like asked this question and is thinking this way. And it's what we've seen so far is that's really forcing people to kind of like confront some of the biases that they have that are implicit towards people or things or groups. And that's something that we think definitely makes it better than kind of like existing things. But yeah, the reason that we think like the information is better is because the outputs themselves aren't just like the raw outputs of like democratic voting. And then on top of that raw output, we'll have multiple outputs, and then we'll have ways of scoring those outputs to contextualize for users. And just in summary.
Yeah, so like I guess how do you collect the data in general? Like this sounds like it requires, like people to be answering a lot of questions. So I imagine you have some sort of like incentive layer, like that's what makes it work. So I assume that's why it's on a blockchain. And so like yeah, like how did you think about like designing the incentive layer for this? How do you get people to use it? Maybe you can go into some detail about that.
Yeah. So we definitely need a lot of user input and data, which making interesting questions is really important for us, and making content like fun that people want to contribute to. And yeah, as you said, the incentives are very important, but it's not just the incentives. So I'll go into the incentives in a sec. I just want to touch on the funness. So the games being fun are way more powerful than the economic incentives. There are constraints to the economic system where you can't really give out large incentives. And so the incentive isn't the thing that creates sticky behavior change. The fun is the thing that creates sticky behavior change. Like whether or not people enjoy answering the questions and revealing the answers to the questions and seeing what the best answer is, and kind of betting on whether or not their guess was good, like that funness is really what's going to keep users kind of like coming back, or hopefully. But the incentives are also very important, right? Because if you screw the incentives up, the output of the information, it can't be trusted. So there's a game theoretic model for this where it's basically like, okay, like we need to incentivize the honest strategy. And that's the first step. It's like, okay, can we incentivize the honest strategy? And then the second, and so the users are just guessing what they actually think. And then the second step is, how do we make this system, at least internally, manipulation proof? So how do you design the incentive such that anybody who wants to attack the system, create an output with one of the answers, wouldn't make any money? There's an additional problem
just
to this.
To maybe summarize for a second here. So the issue here is that like me as a user, like technically I could just try to answer what I think everyone else is going to answer because that would give me the best rewards on the platform, right?
Right. So that's like your Canadian beauty contest, and we actually have that like programmed in, right? Because you're already answering what you think other people answer, and so like the first order answer should be like your answer, and then the second order answer is the Canadian beauty contest of like what you think other people are answering. And basically like you want to create the incentive so that in both questions, in both cases, like the user is incentivized, like their maximally profitable thing to do in expectation is to just be honest. It's like, this is what I think. Like, not, oh, this is what I think the Canadian beauty contest outcome will be, where, everyone's trying to guess what everyone else thinks, and so like everyone else will guess that they think this. But you want to incentivize like the actual honest strategy. And by separating those two questions, we actually are able to do that. And so the incentive here is primarily actually on the second order question. And so it's basically, an exponential curve around like the actual estimator. So the average, say it's like 80. If you're depending on the, like, this is a little bit like mathy and complicated. But depending on how far you are from that, you get some amount of additional reward. And we actually just upped this reward. So if you get the second order estimate exactly correct, like you guessed 80% people say yes, and the average was actually 80% of people saying yes, then you're going to get like 5 times as much bonk as you would have otherwise. And we use bonk as our in-game currency for right now. We'll launch our own token for our own incentives in the future, but we're kind of like validating and getting a lot of information data for the economy through bonk right now. But so the incentive structure is designed to basically get people to only input like what they truly think. And I actually have an article on this in the works right now, and like what the optimal guessing strategy is. There's like 4 or 5 different cases where a user thinks that they know more than everyone else. A user thinks that everyone else knows more than they do. The user like disagrees with the majority. The user agrees with the majority. The user disagrees with the second order answers and like the probabilities. And so there's a few different cases that you have to kind of like prove out that this optimal guessing strategy is the honest strategy.
Let's maybe shift gears a bit and just talk about the consumer angle to all of this, which I think is a really key driver for getting the data at scale, getting people excited. You mentioned that having a fun game is just way more effective than having perfectly designed economics. So this is one of the more unique consumer products I've seen in crypto. It's not like Farcaster or like another Twitter clone. It's a literal game that you can play. Tell us about kind of how you landed on this type of design and how you think this will scale into, let's call it like mainstream adoption.
Yeah. So we landed on this design to some extent for economics reasons, to some extent for but primarily for like user retention reasons. We see a lot of social applications that try to get created, that are feeds that are incentivizing people to come on and like post and do all the things. And it's really hard to get people to contribute to something like that without just like paying them a lot of money. And so like these economic models of most of these things are like fundamentally broken, and they don't really work very well. And so because like I'm a mechanism designer, a lot of it came from kind of like that, where it was like kind of the mechanism that we discovered first, and then we put like a game around it. And the end of it is this social feed platform where you can kind of like search through information. You can see what, so you can ask a question and you can share it to Llama. If Llama follows you, you can show up in his feed, and then, the answers will show up. But it's more of like a Reddit or like kind of Quora style forum platform where people can come on, ask their questions, but they have a lot more confidence in what they're being told and a lot more understanding of kind of like why they're being told that thing. In a much kind of like shorter form where you don't have to spend 4 hours, going down a Reddit rabbit hole. It's like, oh, this is a number that has like all of these different people's opinions like encapsulated in it, and great. And so a lot of the game came from the fact that we need economic risk to drive the economy. And so like, how do you, make risk? Well, make a game. but yeah, it's partially draws on like consensus protocols, like proof of stake, those kinds of things.
So does that mean as like someone asking a question, I have to put up some like bounty for it, or how does that work?
No. So the only time that users pay right now in the app is when they want to reveal the answer to the question. So you don't necessarily, you can answer questions and you can ask questions for right now. But if you want to know the answer to one of the questions that you've already like answered or chomped, then you'll have to pay for that. But you also might make money on it because you pay 5,000 bonk and then you have a chance to win at least 5,000 more bonk up to what is now 50,000 bonk. It used to be 10,000, but we actually just changed this, or are changing this week. So there's a risk component to it, but you might also end up 2xing your bonk, instantaneously.
So isn't there like an incentive for me to just like ask a question that and then like manipulate the answer and then reveal it? Like how do you deal with that?
Yes, there would be if the incentives were improperly designed. So you can basically guarantee that if you're 100% of the answers, that you're not profitable. If you're 90% of the answers, we can still make sure that you're not profitable. And so it's how do you parameterize like that model of like what percent of users should end up being profitable and how profitable should those users be? There's just a constraint of making sure that like this attacker who is some percentage of all of the answers, that attacker isn't profitable up to some constraint, right? Because like if the attacker is like 5% of the answers, then like maybe they get it exactly right for all 5 of those, but they also have a much lower impact on like what that answer is. And so it's not really like as obvious that they're trying to manipulate this thing to be like the answer because they can't access and all the rest of the data. They can't see everyone else's answer. And so it's not that simple to like manipulate. You'd really have to like skew the weights and become a very high portion of like the weight in the population. And once you become that high of a weight, you just won't be profitable in expectation anymore. Like we don't give out enough rewards in bonk to make you profitable, to reveal all of those answers.
So you were saying earlier that perhaps the end form of this set of products will look something along the lines of Reddit or Quora, but much more perhaps information dense and easier for people to find like the truth about something. And obviously the current first iteration of the product is this is Chomp, which is the quiz game. One actually just random question I had was how are you guys currently producing all of these questions, or I guess you guys call them decks as well, because it feels like a lot of work. But I'm just curious, like how are you doing that?
It's a lot of me and a lot of our team. So we have 2 people helping with questions right now, but it's a lot of us doing it and coming up with the questions, which will change. So we currently allow users to come and ask us questions, but we still moderate them and like approve them and kind of go through that kind of stuff. But we're going to start working on a couple of new features for users to actually filter out the questions that they want to see on the platform using the same surprisingly popular like mechanic. And so they'll also be able to like earn from that and kind of have fun playing the game in like slightly different contexts where they're doing the same things but deciding what questions that they would want to answer and what questions they think other people would want to answer. The end goal is definitely for this to be like entirely UGC, where people can come on and make their own decks, whether it's about themselves, whether it's about something that they're interested in, whether it's about something that they're doing, whether it's about their friends, whatever. And that kind of like aspect of bringing people together is something that we're really excited about because a lot of the information that we have on, you know, people like people's interests and their reputations on, like, you know, what kind of topics they are experts in, for example, it's really hard to find people who are like that. Like, it took me a long time in crypto to find people who could, you know, understand what I was talking about when I talked about like DeFi stuff and like AMM models and, you know, interest rates and optimal control and things like that. And it would be super cool if, you know, there was just somewhere I could go, like, oh, here's all these people who have, you know, these reputations that are above, you know, 70%. I can just go hop in that group chat with them because I also have, you know, a reputation above like 70%, and now I'm part of this community. And that's something that we think like a lot of this unlocks that we're really excited about. But that's obviously, you know, a pretty long ways down the road.
So it sounds a little bit like you are doing prediction markets in a sense. Like this could be used to say like predict the election. Maybe you could give us like a more concrete like compare and contrast against like Polymarket, because we've seen them exploding in recent days, right? They have like I think they've had like some of their biggest uptick in users recently.
Yeah.
And so like I guess I'd just like to understand like how this is either similar or different, you know, than like a Farcaster, and like can it be used as an Oracle data feed for like a prediction market, you know, if someone were to compose on top of you, or like how are you thinking about those things?
Yeah, so we are very similar to a prediction market. It's certainly got prediction market elements to it. One of the key like legal differences is that we don't give people incentives for like the actual outcome of an event, right? So like you're not gambling on whether or not Biden will drop out of the US presidential race. You are revealing like the answer and like what other people think. So like the event itself does not decide whether or not you like make money in this situation. So that's one of the differences. But it is like a social prediction tool. So we are trying to use the wisdom of the crowd the same way that like a market does, like a futarchy does, like a Polymarket does. It's very similar. We're more like sentiment and like kind of like opinion based than like a Polymarket is. So they are explicitly trying to predict the outcome of the event. Whereas what we're trying to predict is how people feel about that event at like a moment in time. And use that to predict like the outcome of the event. So we actually asked the question, like, will Biden drop out of the US presidential race? And we got it right. We actually revealed like the answer revealed, so it was able to be revealed like the day that he dropped out of the race. It's actually really funny. But yeah, so if that answer had been revealed like a day before, like it would have been a prediction. But what that really is a snapshot of how people feel at a moment in time. Like the with question, right? It's not necessarily that people say that like the answer is no, so that like it won't hit $10 billion market cap. It's that like right now, the sentiment in this market is that it won't do that in some sort of like, you know, immediate time frame. It's less like specific and exact. And it gets at more of kind of like the context, as I kind of like been talking about, like the other things that are going on, like the emotions, how people like feel about it. And
it's like a fear and greed index for everything, basically, right?
More or less. And it has a much wider array of like market participants, right? Like I don't participate in Polymarket, for example. Like I don't really gamble on like those kinds of events, but I'm curious what other people think about them, and I want to kind of like share my opinions on them. And Chomp is a way for me to do that, and do that without, you know, taking excessive financial risk at all, and, you know, potentially making money on it. Like that's not really the reason that I'm doing. Like I'm interested in like the actual answer to the question itself, and then like the money is kind of like, oh, a nice thing on top that, you know, makes it more fun.
So can you just concretely explain like where the financialization is happening here? Is it more so as just like potential reward for participating in this process. Obviously, it's not like you're taking on risk like Polymarket. So
Yeah, so you're basically betting on how good your guess is. So when I reveal an answer, I pay 5,000 bonk. And then when that answer is revealed, so there's the first order answer, which is like yes or no. Does your guess for that match the best answer? If you match the best answer, you immediately get your 5,000 bonk back. So you have zero risk if you got the answer right.
Mhm.
And then this, depending on the second order answer, you have like say you guess 75 and the actual average was like 80. So you're like 5 points away from 80. Depending on like how distributed all of those second order answers are from like everybody who answered that question, if you're within the top 50% of like distances, then you'll get an extra reward. And the closer you are to that 80%, you'll get an exponentially increasing reward up to 50,000 bonk. Currently it's 10,000. It will be made 50,000 in the next like week ish. But that's kind of how it works on the reward stuff. So you're basically betting on whether or not you guess well.
very cool.
So it seems like this would be like really, really useful for existing social apps, right? Just like drive like their home pages or their content feeds or anything like that. Have you thought about like providing this as like an oracle for some of those like on-chain things?
Uh, yeah. I mean, I think like Oracle. I'm personally concerned about like people being like this is a source of truth. I'm like very anal about like the best answer and like
Mm.
objectivity is actually subjective. Like there's this whole like other realm of like possibility, but yeah, I think that's something that we're really trying to explore a lot. We've talked to a few different social applications on how we can help them. Also, like things that you don't necessarily think are like social protocols, like DAOs, right? Like the Jupe DAO, for example. Like people are just voting yes on everything because they get paid to do it. So like, why wouldn't they do it? um, and so like you can kind of help them filter out for people who read the post and actually learned what it had to say and spent 3 seconds thinking about it, or just be supplementary to other social protocols, as you're saying, as something that a poly market could make a market for, like what is the outcome of like this answer on Chomp. And so yeah, it can definitely be used as like an oracle and composed with, and that's really something that we want to happen.
So throughout this interview, you kind of alluded to a few perhaps like economics frameworks or concepts. I'm wondering if you can maybe just walk through, anything that you used to inform the building of this. I think you mentioned like the Keynesian beauty contest was one of them. Just for, my curiosity, I would love to just dive into some of these concepts and maybe our listeners would too. Because I think these are really at the heart of what's super novel about this is embedding these primitives into the game itself and in order to produce more interesting information.
Yeah. So there's like a lot of things
Yeah.
here. Um, Generally, like I think about this problem in a way that I really don't hear anyone else talking about in the same way. Um, so like so I'm in crypto because I have like a core fundamental belief that tokens are simply the single greatest opportunity in all of human history to explore large scale coordination mechanisms of human behavior. Um, and that's not how most people think about tokens in general. They're like, oh, like I'm gonna, make this token and distribute it to a bunch of people, and we're gonna make a DAO, and I don't need to think about how it fits into my product, because I'll just like make it work with, whatever product I end up building. Um, I think like token first, like, okay, like how do we make an economy that makes a product that people want to consume, that they don't necessarily need to have a blockchain for. Like my mom can play Chomp. My mom plays Chomp. She does not know how to use a wallet. Like, it's incredible.
Wow.
And so we started with this idea of like, okay, how do we create an economy that produces this kind of like information product that we want to see in the world, that like we think would be helpful, that like we personally want to use. Um, and it's very similar to like DeepIn, and it's also, similar to how consensus protocols work. Like you could think of like Ethereum. Um, Ethereum's economy incentivizes the builders and the validators and the searchers to build blocks and produce those blocks and validate those blocks. And Ethereum's product is block space. So Ethereum, through Ether, has created the economy to produce their consumable product, which is block space. And in the same way, you should think about designing token economies to create a consumable product that is something. And in our case, that product is information. And in general, consumer apps are like slightly different from, like your DeFi protocol or like a DAO token. And there are specific things that I've thought about a lot for these kinds of apps. And a lot of it is like fairly basic, like economic things that I think people just kind of, forgot when we decided we're going to make a new economic regime and a new economic system. Like, for example, everyone makes a capped supply token. Like, why? Everyone takes the meme from Bitcoin of being 21.2 million tokens. And optimizing for being a store of value. And it's like, okay, like that's how I'm going to do it. And they take it from stocks, and they also don't realize that like, oh, companies can execute stock splits. They can issue more stock. Like that's not a finite a really finite amount of stock. And so it's not like the same like store of value kind of thing. And so then they take it from Bitcoin. Okay. But is that the best thing for your economy? Like, is that the best way for you to create an economy that has value flow, that allows the creation of a product? No, it's not. Like, if you go back to like the very early Ethereum papers when Vitalik was just posting on the forums in like 2013, he talks a lot about this, and a lot about, an uncapped money supply and how that, makes hard money. Because if you want to create a good economy, and economies are measured in how much value flows through them and how much value that they create, well, you should probably create the medium of value transfer in that economy to exist in such a way that like it incentivizes for value to flow through that, not for value to stop. And like that's the uncapped versus cap supply thing. And so like there's a lot of things like that I just don't think people are really thinking about in terms of like how do we create the best economy here, and just having like that end output in mind. For us, it's like information. Like how do we create this economy that has just the best information, and it's mostly simple economic stuff. Like I don't think any of it is like really all that complicated. It's just about, how do we solve this problem specifically the best? And I don't think most people in crypto are thinking about like the best way to use a token to solve like their exact problem. They're kind of taking this blueprint from other places, whether it's a DAO, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's, Ethereum or something else, and, slapping a token on top of a product and calling it a day. And I think there's just like this whole massively underexplored like design space on how to create economies and what kind of, positive externalities you can create by just creating some incentives. And like that's really the design ethos with which we created Chomp.
Super interesting. And definitely a lot to think about that I think is not mainstream, especially for people that are builders. So we obviously covered a lot of topics today. Wanted to kind of close off with, what can we look forward to with respect to Chomp? What's kind of the easiest way for people to get involved, and what's on the horizon?
Yeah, we've a few really exciting things. So right now we have meme coin madness with Orca. So we have like a bracket style tournament going on with
Nice.
like 16 different meme coins, all pitted against each other. And the winner gets a liquidity pool on Orca with some Orca token emissions, so some extra rewards there. And then we're constantly working on stuff on the back end and have a couple new features that are hopefully going to come out over the next like couple weeks, and one really exciting kind of like mini product, I would call it, that is like a new form factor for Chomp, that I don't want to spoil the reveal of, but we're very excited about it. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And then a couple more features in the pipeline, like I mentioned, the filtering for questions and the filtering for tags, like the topics of questions as well. And those are the things on like the immediate term. Hopefully some more games in the next kind of like year ish. I think we're still working through some of like the early bugs and things like that for Chomp, and figuring out how everything works the best. But definitely want to expand on our game offering for users, and that will probably look like the same mechanisms in different ways, and also new mechanisms and new games. Yeah.
So it's an iOS app or PWA, or how does the user go and start playing Chomp
It's
if they want
so
to
we have a
get to it?
PWA. You can download the app or play on desktop. Most people definitely play on the Phantom browser in Phantom, because just the easiest wallet experience. Um, yeah,
Well, Isaac, thanks so much for joining us, telling us about Chomp and Gator, and love the vision and love what you guys are building.
yeah. Thank you guys for having me on. I really appreciate it.